Mr. President, we're all returning to a snowy Washington, D.C., but it never ceases to amaze me when I come back to the nation's capital from home back in Texas, the disconnect between what people are focused on back home, mainly their jobs, their family, and, well, football. That didn't turn out so well for us this weekend, but the mainstream media and, of course, social media, which amplifies what people are talking about or the message that they want to convey, the so-called influencers that are really, in some instances, nothing more than propagandists, and even our foreign adversaries are engaged in a nonstop battle to control the narrative here in Washington, D.C. on a variety of issues, including the terrorist attack that occurred in Israel on October the 7th of last year. Yesterday marked 100 days since Hamas terrorists murdered more than 1,200 Israelis and took about 240 hostages. I traveled to Israel with several of my Senate colleagues on the Senate Intelligence Committee last week, and we witnessed the grief and the fear that has gripped the Israeli people over the last few months. It was a familiar feeling because it seemed very much like where the American people were 3 months after the attacks of 9/11, 2001, when Al-Qaeda killed 3,000 Americans. In Tel Aviv, photos of the hostages who are still being held captive by Hamas lined the walkway. The photo of a 9-month-old baby held hostage literally stopped me in my tracks, wondering who would it be, what kind of person would take a 9-month-old baby and hold it hostage. And in the face of every person I spoke with, from families of hostages to senior government officials, there was understandably a deep sense of shock, mourning, and anger. Again, it reminded me of how we felt after 9/11. We were grieving, we were shocked, we were angry, and we were absolutely committed to holding those responsible accountable. Our shared sense of purpose extended far beyond the borders of the United States. Our friends and allies around the world said, "We have America's back," and they supported our mission to destroy the Al-Qaeda threat. Well, that's exactly the kind of response you would expect when a terrorist group viciously attacks a friend: solidarity. Sadly, Israel has not received the overwhelming support that our country did in the wake of 9/11. In the more than 100 days since this war began, Israel's been criticized for defending itself. It has been villainized for going after the terrorist group that murdered, raped, and kidnapped its people. Now, this is not a view just held by a few people. Anti-Israeli rhetoric has spread like wildfire across social media. It's taken root at elite college campuses and even here in the halls of Congress. This past weekend, we saw the latest chapter in blaming the victim as thousands of protesters gathered in downtown Washington, D.C. to demand a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, I would say a ceasefire would be great, but there's no guarantee Hamas won't continue to kill innocent men, women, and children. So it's just not feasible. Protesters chanted, "Ceasefire now, end the war." In Gaza, they carried signs that said, "Free Palestine and let Gaza live." They accused Israel of being an apartheid government and outrageously said the United States was supporting genocide. Again, this was not a small protest. Thousands of people lined the streets of our nation's capital, and countless others protested around the world as part of a global day of resistance, it was called. I find it deeply disturbing to see this view shared by so many because it's completely divorced from reality. These protesters have the entire problem completely backward. Hamas is not a victim. Hamas is the aggressor in every possible sense, along with its state sponsor, Iran. While we were in Israel, my colleagues and I were shown footage of the October 7th attack, which was captured by Hamas terrorists. In other words, they were taking video of themselves killing innocent men, women, and children. They intentionally filmed all these atrocities they committed so the entire world could see. But what we saw affirms that these are not victims in any sense. Hamas, that is. They are murderers. They're rapists. They're kidnappers. And they are terrorists. Hamas carried out the most gruesome atrocities I've ever seen, and I hope to never see those again. But we cannot, under any set of circumstances, allow them to be viewed as the victim in this war. This is not only Israeli blood on the hand of Hamas. Hamas is also responsible for immense suffering by civilians living in Gaza. Hamas raises vast amounts of money from the Palestinian people and outside donors. But that money does next to nothing to support a better quality of life for Palestinians. It isn't invested in schools, hospitals, or housing. Instead, it's used to arm Hamas's wartime operations. This terrorist group spends vast amounts of money building tunnels beneath the streets of Gaza, some 500 kilometers. It's a virtual city under a city. It allows it to hoard weapons, and we literally saw manufacturing facilities for weapons and ammunition in the tunnels. And of course, it's used to keep food and fuel and shield themselves from the violence above ground. Unfortunately, these tunnels are also used to hide the hostages, more than 100 of whom are still in Hamas captivity. Hamas builds these tunnels beneath hospitals and schools and other vulnerable locations in order to give credence to the Hamas's lie that it is a victim, not the aggressor. Now, Mr. President, here in the United States, we're thousands of miles away from this war. Hamas didn't invade our neighborhoods. They didn't murder and kidnap our family or friends, and they aren't launching rockets that threaten us each night. But just because we aren't living with the daily realities of this war doesn't mean that we can be divorced from it. War is not just a battle of brute force. It's also a contest for public opinion. Hamas goes to great lengths to shift the narrative and build sympathy. It's not a new strategy, but deeply disappointing to see how many Hamas sympathizers are found on American soil. It's disheartening that scores of Americans are lapping up Hamas's lies. By claiming that Israel is the aggressor, they are playing directly into these terrorists' hands. We know war is ugly. It's tragic. It hurts innocent people and punishes the most vulnerable. William Tecumseh Sherman, Civil War general, said, "War is hell. You can't qualify war in harsher terms than I will. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it." Well, the realities of this war are nothing short of devastating, and I understand the desire for the violence to end, and I hope and pray that it will soon. But we must remember this can only happen when the Hamas threat is defeated. The ultimate goal of Hamas, along with its state sponsor of Iran, is to end the Jewish state, to wipe Israel off the map. That's the only risk of genocide in this war. We have a responsibility to call out and correct the falsehood and mischaracterizations that are spreading in our own country. We have a responsibility to do our best to inform the American people about the facts and to make sure they understand who is the aggressor and who is the victim. And in the end, I believe we have a duty to stand with our ally, Israel, as it does what is needed to root out the terrorist threats in its own country. Mr. President, I yield the floor.